Let's break down the truth about inflation. No narratives, just the facts. The fact of the matter is, a ton of people are talking about inflation who have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. And they're coming up with all these big ideas that are not found in reality. So let's talk about the reality so we can reset this conversation. Let's define inflation, since people don't seem to really know what it means. Here's the Wikipedia article I'm just going to tell you. Inflation, let's simplify it. It's like when your grandma goes, back in the 60s, a stick of gum was only 5 cents, and now it's $1. That's inflation. It's your money doesn't buy you as much as it used to because the purchasing power of it went down. That's inflation. Okay, well, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? It really depends. It depends on the rate of inflation. So when we had really, really high inflation, it was 9%. 9% is way too high. It means you feel the inflation every single day with all the things you're trying to purchase. What the Fed wants to see is about a 2 to 3% inflation rate every single year. That's something where the economy continues to grow because inflation means the economy is healthy and growing, but you don't feel it so much as a person anymore. It's now going to be something that can be adjusted as your wage hopefully goes with the rate of inflation. I can only imagine people here going, well, I still feel inflation. Inflation didn't get fixed. It actually did, but you aren't going to feel it. And I'm going to walk through why that's the case in this video and how you need to understand that inflation is not something you can just turn back time on and feel the old prices. That's not how it works, and these prices are pretty much here to stay. So let's talk about why everything went so crazy in 2022, why inflation jumped way up. There were a multitude of factors, but let's talk about the most important factors. First, we're going to talk about the pandemic. And the pandemic's biggest effect in business and inflation was supply chain. The supply chain during the pandemic was absolutely decimated. Not only was it decimated, but demand went way up in some areas and went way down in other areas, and everybody was in this major adjustment period. But the biggest problem was, on top of all these big shifts in demand, you had a reduction in the amount of people who could safely come to work or willing to come to work. Many people just wouldn't do it anymore. So you had a tremendous disruption in supply chain. And when you have that disruption in supply chain, you have an effect on the business that's trying to provide you with that supply. And they are going to have to jack up the price because it's harder for them to make the product and get it to you. Next was the Russia-Ukraine war. Not a great situation just in general, but especially for inflation because Russia is a huge energy provider in the world. For the US, it was less than 10% of our imports. So for the US, it was not a huge deal. We can make up for most of it in our reserves. Not a big problem. The big problem was with the EU. The EU was extraordinarily reliant on Russia for petroleum, and they got fucked. I mean, that's just the bottom line. And when the EU gets fucked, the whole world gets fucked. The market is a global market. We are not disconnected from one another. That's why the Japanese market started to fail when our market started to fail this past week. It's just how it is. Next is the stimulus packages that both Trump and Biden passed. Now, the stimulus packages are meant to keep money in the pockets of Americans while the pandemic was taking away a lot of their jobs and making it very difficult for the economy to continue to function the way it was before. Now, most people, for some reason, seem to believe that Joe Biden is more to blame in this area than Donald Trump was. But I'm going to pop up a little graphic for you. I made it really simple. Trump, $3 trillion in stimulus packages. Biden, 1.9 trillion together for just under $5 trillion. The reason I bring this up is oftentimes people go, Joe Biden with the stimulus, Joe Biden. Trump did more stimulus. Now, was it wrong for the stimulus packages to happen? That's open for debate for both of these guys. Now, we don't know what the alternative was. If we hadn't have given this stimulus package to people and businesses, would the economy have failed? Probably, but we don't really know the details. So it's really just inauthentic to go, this was a huge mistake. You have no idea if it was a mistake. It could have been a bigger mistake not to do it. But either way, just so you know, stimulus packages, $5 trillion, Trump did more than Biden. Last but not least is interest rates. The Fed lowered interest rates during the pandemic to about zero, which means essentially you could just borrow free money. I mean, of course, you have to pay it back, but it's not going to be carrying interest. So money was essentially not free, but extraordinarily cheap. So it devalued currency tremendously, which at the time was smart because we were trying to stimulate the economy by getting more money into the pockets of people who wanted to continue to do business and support the economy. But eventually, that was going to lead to some massive inflation because you're flooding the market with money. Here is the cumulative effect of all of these things. This is 2020 inflation. This is 2024 inflation. You see in the beginning of the pandemic, inflation was pretty much at an all-time low because the economy was completely falling apart. As we started to stimulate it, it goes up. As we continue, the war occurs, goes really far up. The Fed raises rates, cools off inflation, and we flatten out at around 3%, which is where we are now, which is an ideal target. This is where we want to be. And let me just bring up one more thing. This was not just a US problem. This is global inflation. And this right here is the same period we just saw in the US and the subsequent cooling off. This was a global issue. This did not just affect the United States. This is a worldwide problem because the same things that happened in the US happened everywhere else. Even stimulus. Most countries, at least first world countries, had a stimulus package. So every single element of this, supply chain, the war in Russia, stimulus packages, interest rate changes, all of it happened in every single country, and that is why you saw the same thing happen in every other place in the world at the same rate and the same time. Now, I know at this point people are going to go, well, I still feel inflation. Inflation's still a problem. You're going to feel it forever. It's not going to change. The only way to make it go back to pre-pandemic pricing would be something called deflation, which is where you have a less than zero on the rate of inflation, which means the economy is in severe trouble. You're going to see recessions and even depressions in cases like that, because essentially it means that economic growth is not happening. In fact, economic damage is being done. Now, will eventually those things level out and prices will come back to being at a rate where it'll be pre-pandemic prices? Sure, but you're going to do an excessive amount of damage. And let me tell you something, Trump isn't going to do that. Biden's not going to do that. Kamala Harris isn't going to, nobody is going to embrace tactics that are going to create deflation, because it will crater the world economy. It will be a massive problem, and it will just repeat this cycle again. We're trying to cool it at a responsible rate, but the unfortunate situation is that means that you guys and me and everybody else, we're stuck with these new prices. They're not going anywhere. Certain sectors may get cheaper here and there, housing and things like that, especially when rates are really affecting the price of something, but most things are going to stay around the same price. And I'll tell you why. It's a really important thing. It's called corporate greed. Corporations are at a point right now where they've raised prices, and people for the most part are just going, all right, I guess I got to pay this new price. And what are they going to do? Go, oh, poor consumers, let me give you money back. Fuck that shit. They're going to be capitalists, and they're going to go, they're willing to pay it, fuck it. And they're going to have all-time high profits, which is exactly what they have right now, and they're not going to give them up. So what's remaining from a inflation perspective is the fact that these corporations are just entirely unwilling to lower the prices for anything unless you stop paying for these things and show that the market will not bear their new price. But because people aren't really going to do that, except for a few places, they're just going to keep their prices high. And there's nothing that any president can do. A president can't go in and tell a corporation, hey, you can't do that. They can only really do that when they're breaking antitrust laws. And most of these corporations are not breaking antitrust laws. They're just price gouging you. But they're not price gouging you illegally. They're just going, well, this is how much it costs now. We're just going to raise the price, keep it high. So look, I know it's natural. Everybody's looking around for somebody to blame in this situation. You got a lot of places to look. You can definitely blame Trump. You could definitely blame Biden. Those two guys made some big decisions in terms of allocating $5 trillion into stimulus packages. That really didn't help inflation. You could blame Putin and Zelensky for this conflict that's going on in Ukraine and Russia. You could blame the Fed for mismanaging interest rates, and you can blame corporations for going, fuck it, you're going to pay what I charge, so I don't care, I'll charge more. This is a multifactorial problem that has been solved in terms of the inflation rate. That has been solved. So if you go, oh, inflation's still high under Biden, it's not. It's at 3%, which is what the Fed wants it to be, which is why they're going to start cutting rates in September. But the truth of the matter is, you're going to keep feeling it. It's just how it's going to be. This is going to keep feeling like shit, and the only way to really counteract it is wage growth. So if you want to vote based on fixing inflation, how much you feel it, vote for the person who's going to increase your wage.